Hey, everybody. Tonight, I want to provide some insight into what expropriation without compensation looks like on American soil. Many of us have tried bringing light to some of the political turmoil taking place in South Africa, including a new law that gives South Africa legal jurisdiction over private property. But as an American citizen, I'm actually more curious about what this construct looks like in America. So I dug up a little dirt. My name is Monica Maybank, and this is the Holy Politician Podcast. On this podcast, we discuss politics, policy, and culture through the lens of truth and holiness. If you haven't subscribed, I'd encourage you to do that now. So, as many of you know, in a recent podcast, I briefly described South Africa's new land law, which is called Expropriation Without Compensation. And so in January of this year, South African President Cyril Ramaphosa signed into law a new bill that allows land seizures by the state without compensation. And so this new law allows for land to be expropriated or taken without any kind of payment in circumstances where it is deemed, quote, just and equitable in the public interest, unquote, to do so. Well, it is true that the United States Constitution also has an expropriation provision in its Fifth Amendment, where it reads, here's the handy dandy Constitution, nor shall private property be taken for public use without just compensation. And so, if you haven't looked at your Constitution, you can order one on Amazon. The US Constitution permits for private property to be taken for public use, right? But it requires that private owners of that land be compensated. So this is in contrast to South Africa's new law, obviously. But unfortunately, we know that there is a history of that particular provision in our Constitution being blatantly violated, particularly in years past when it came to Black property owners. But that violation has had a ripple effect across generations. If you've never read The Color of Law by Richard Rothstein, I encourage you to read it. It's a provocative and horrifying tale of how the Black community in America was precluded from building significant wealth and passing it down generationally because of state-sponsored segregation. Also because of redlining, which is essentially marking an entire community as less than desirable. But also there was land that was actually taken by force from the Black community without compensation. This book is a provocative read. Again, I would encourage you to read it. But here's a snippet from Richard Rothstein's book, and this is him going on a speaking circuit. Listen to this clip.
We created a white noose around every urban area with federally subsidized single-family home subdivisions. These were giant subdivisions in many cases. The most famous of them, I'm sure you've heard of it, is Levittown, east of New York City. 17,000 homes in one place. What bank would be crazy enough to lend a developer the money to build 17,000 homes or 15,000 homes in one place for which he had no buyers? We were in a suburban country at that time. People thought the whole idea was lunacy. Who's going to want to live in a single-family home when they can live in the city instead? Any of these developers, the only way they could get the capital to build these giant subdivisions was by going to the Federal Housing Administration, submitting their plans for the development, for approval of the construction materials they were going to use, the architectural design, the layout of the streets in the subdivision, and an explicit commitment not to sell a home to an African American, required by the Federal Housing Administration. The Federal Housing Administration even required, as a condition of these guarantees, developers like Levitt to place a clause in the deed of every home prohibiting resale to African Americans or rental to African Americans. These deeds still exist in these homes today. They're no longer enforced, no longer enforceable, but they're still there. What was the consequence of this? Well, those homes in those days, in all of these suburbs, they sold for $10,000 or less, $8,000, $9,000 a piece. In today's money, that's less than $100,000, probably $90,000. African Americans who were prohibited, not they didn't want to, not because they didn't like living among whites, they were prohibited from moving into these suburbs, and they could easily afford to do so. Any working class family can afford to buy a home for $90,000, roughly twice national median income. Those homes and developments like that now sell for $300,000, $400,000, $500,000 and more. The white families over the next couple of generations gained You can do the arithmetic, 200, 300, 400, $500,000 in equity. They use that equity to send their children to college, to take care of medical emergencies, to take care of economic downturns, most importantly, to bequeath it to their children, who then had down payments for their own homes. African Americans who accumulated none of that wealth as a result of this federal subsidy had none of those abilities. Today, nationwide, African American incomes are on average about 60% of white incomes. African American wealth today is 10% of white wealth. That enormous disparity between a 60% income ratio and a 10% wealth ratio is entirely attributable to unconstitutional federal housing policy practiced in the mid-20th century that has never been remedied. It's a constitutional violation. Of course, it determines the ongoing racial inequalities we have today.
Absolutely devastating. And according to Richard Rothstein, government-sponsored segregation was actually implemented by our nation's most liberal leaders. He talks about that in the preface to his book. And so this notion of segregation and racial discrimination by liberal leaders appears to be a theme, although on its face you wouldn't know it. In 1968, the Kerner Commission published its influential report that ties in with America's government-sponsored segregation. And this Kerner Commission, as it was officially called, the National Advisory Commission on Civil Disorders, was established by President Lyndon B. Johnson in 1967, who was a Democrat, to investigate the causes of the race riots that erupted in 23 major cities in the 60s, particularly the cities of Detroit and Newark. And so the purpose of the commission was threefold. It was to understand what exactly happened during these riots, to understand why they took place in the first place, and then finally to determine what could be done to mitigate future riots. And so the commission's final report was pretty blunt and historic because nobody had ever said the types of things that were said about ghettos or the Black community in the 60s. And so its most famous line was, quote, "Our nation is moving toward two societies, one Black, one white, separate and unequal," end quote. The report concluded that the riots were not caused by outside agitators, as many had claimed at the time, but it also said that the root causes of the riots were systemic racism, poverty and unemployment in the Black community, police brutality in the Black community, and a lack of access to education, housing, and health care. And so the all-white commissioners concluded that, quote, "White society is deeply implicated in the ghetto. White institutions created it, white institutions maintain it, and white society condones it," end quote. So I'm sure that there are many South Africans that find that sentiment agreeable in their own nation. Unfortunately, though, now in America, like in South Africa, whites are not the only ones to blame. Blacks in both places have now become the oppressors of their own people. We are oppressing our own for a little bitty, itty, minute bit of power, for a small amount of prestige. We're looking to make a name for ourselves. We're looking to be influential. We're looking to kind of have our name in the C-suite to be famous, whatever, right? We have indiscriminately, throughout the last several decades, voted for civic leaders that have had an adverse effect on our communities. And most of the time, particularly in America, the Black community is not voting for public policy, they're voting for personality. And this is something I've talked about a lot, is that we need to spend more time looking at the policy on its face and doing our due diligence to see, is this policy actually helping or hurting our community? But because these personalities often look like me, or they will say things that rile you up against the opposite party, or they'll get you to think that all Republicans or conservatives are racist, we will vote against an agenda that actually could be benefiting our community. And so although President Johnson, a Democrat, signed an executive order calling this Kerner Commission into action, he largely ignored the recommendations. There were no major federal actions or activities that took place from that report. And the issues highlighted in the report remain largely unchanged. And in some cases, they got worse, right? So this stuff is messy. But I want to reiterate this over and over and over and over and over and over again. The oppressed should never, ever, ever become the oppressor. And in America and South Africa, unfortunately, we see these things beginning to unfold. And frankly, it's not godly. This is not God in a picture where we begin to take matters in our own hands and decide that we want to then strip the rights and the liberties of people away because we're trying to compensate for something that happened years before, right? We can do our due diligence to make amends, but when we begin to become the oppressor and strip away other people's rights, that's not justice. That's not the justice that Jesus advocated. So we should continue to be diligent, do our research, and learn our history. Again, The Color of Law is a good read. If you haven't read it, I'd encourage you to do it. It will give really good insight into how discrimination really played a role that was government sponsored in the role of what became known as America's ghettos and what has led to this divide between the economic power of a society in America. Thanks for watching. Until next time, God bless.